back to the show, Business Mastery for Startups, Scale-Ups, and Early Stage Businesses with your host, Jerry Gadori. That's me. And in this week's show, I'm super excited to have somebody from across the pond, unless, of course, you're speaking from Mike's audience or watching from Mike's audience, in which case I'm across the pond. We've got Mike Bank, a specialist in the startup community who has a program over in Britain that I can't wait to share about and talk about. Mike, could you do a little better than I did in our intro and tell us more about yourself?
I'll try my best, Jerry. But firstly, thank you for having me on the show.
You're welcome.
I'm really privileged to be here. I am a subject matter expert in myself. So I'll do my best to do a short intro. And briefly, I started my career many moons ago, as you can probably tell from the grey hair. I notice yours is trimmed short, but mine less.
I named my company Redbeard, but if there were truth in advertising, I'd have to call it Greybeard.
In the grey hairs, my friend. But the grey hairs didn't start until I joined the world of startups.
Fair. Little known fact, Mike's actually 19 years old.
Yeah, over 2 decades ago, I certainly was. But yeah, I mean, actually, at 19, I worked for IBM, at the time, the biggest tech company in the world. Then during my summer at uni, or one of my summers at uni, I worked for Deloitte, which was one of the big four, but nearly got a job pre-uni at Arthur Andersen, which blew up during the Enron scandal. And then after uni, we joked. So I went to London School of Economics, bang in the centre of London. And we used to joke that you would turn left and go into Westminster or politics, or turn right and go into the City of London and finance. And I took a hard right. But I worked in Canary Wharf for a company called Citigroup, which you've probably heard about, and certainly your listeners will have. Again, at the time of my joining in 2007, the world's greatest, as in largest financial institution. But yeah, we all know what happened to IBM and Citigroup. So
I'm going to be honest, you sounded like bad luck. Maybe we stop here.
Well, I mean, let's see. Recording goes, Jerry. But yeah, I meant to spend 1 year there, but I joined in 2007, a great year. And then obviously 2008 came and the GFC, or Great Financial Crisis, occurred. So the type of work that I was doing tended to be things like emergency rights issues, where companies were going back to the market and essentially begging for money just to stay afloat. A bit of work on behalf of the UK government, valuing some of the assets that they'd taken over from various banks that they bailed out in the UK. So it was interesting work, but not really aligned with what I'd always wanted to do, which is jump into the world of startups and start my own thing. But as the world began opening up again, I started working with, and this was a conscious choice on my part, and I used to get shouted at by some of the more senior bankers. I align myself with a lot of owner-operators who were built up what at the time seemed like small businesses relative to the multi-billion-dollar big corporates that we were typically working with. Now I think, $500 million is not that small. So I align myself with them, and they seem to like me, and I certainly like working with them. And eventually I just took the leap. Have you heard of a guy called Tim Ferriss, who wrote the 4-Hour Work Week? It's a really cool guy. And back then he was talking about the real world MBA, which is where you take your business school money and you invest it in a hands-on way into startups. Now, Jerry, he's not talking about that so loudly anymore. And I think I know why. Because I did that. And I quit my job. Spent a bit of time, I'm not going to lie, on the beach in Brazil, chilling out and did a bit of traveling to decompress after working 80-plus hour weeks for 5 years. But then got stuck straight in and investing in startups at the stage I was investing in back then, which was often pre-team, post-idea. Maybe they had a product, maybe they didn't. But often the first check-in, that was super rare back then. And the accelerators that we hear about these days didn't really exist, or at least weren't prevalent in London, where I was based. But coincidentally, or by chance, I suppose, blind luck, I met a couple of guys who were running their own VC, and they were missing a sort of finance brain, so they invited me to join them, not as a partner, but as a more junior member of the team. So I learned a ton by working with them and by doing. But they were builders at heart. That's how they made their money. They made their money by building companies that were spitting off cash, and they were using that cash to invest into startups, as well as a bit of outside investor money. So we ended up creating a venture studio before they were really a thing. That was probably 2013, 14. Then we spun a company out of that, got external VC funding for the first time in my case, and that business spectacularly failed. It completely blew up. So that was a learning lesson for sure as to what not to do. But we tried to give some of the remaining money back to our investors, and they said, look, we're not interested. It doesn't really work for us. We've invested in you. Why don't you go and use that money to do something else? So we've spun up a couple of other businesses off the back of our experiences there, including a co-working space before Adam Newman and WeWork came to London. So we operated that for about a year and a half before he came in and blew up the market with SoftBank's money, and a couple of other things that I did on the side. But that bug of actually building stuff, that hadn't left me. So I ended up joining Antler, which is a startup creator. Have you heard of them, Antler?
I have not.
No, a lot of people haven't. In my world, they are ginormous and they've done exceptionally well. So they were founded, I think, in 2017 in Singapore by a chap called Magnus Grimeland, who was a Harvard alumnus. I think he studied at the same time as Zuckerberg, although I didn't know him. Then he joined McKinsey, I believe. I think he was like an ex-Norwegian Special Forces chap as well. So he had this really interesting mix of background. So the people who operate Antler tend to be one or more of from the Nordic regions in Europe, ex-forces / professional athletes, because by his thinking, they tend, like the characteristics you must exhibit, and you're ex-forces, I believe, as well, right?
Yeah, Marine Signals Intelligence.
But excel in business as well, right?
Yes. There really is, I don't want to derail the conversation, but all things being equal, I'll always bias towards veterans, especially if what they did in the military was high stakes, because you develop a mindset and a perspective that's hard to match anywhere else.
And an old boss of mine, another startup, I actually said this to him once. I said, how the heck do you stay so calm in these high-stakes situations? And he looked at me a bit funny and he said, Mike, no one's going to die if I make the wrong call here. In my old job, so he was an officer in the British Army. It was like, in my old job, people would literally die. So this is no stress to me at all.
It's funny you say that. As a 19-year-old PFC and Lance Corporal, I had to do intel briefs for admirals, generals, congressmen, and senators. And so when I left the military later on after 4 knee surgeries, and I was in technical recruiting and business sales, and I was talking to these CEOs, and I didn't bat an eyelash at them. One of them actually asked me, said, usually younger people like yourself have a hard time speaking to me. And I was like, I spoke to congressmen and senators regularly. You are not intimidating.
I love that. And it just puts things in perspective. And actually, even at Citigroup, when we were, I think it might have been our associate training. So after a few years, we got promoted. My class got promoted. And then we were flown out to New York and spent time there. But when we came back, we had all sorts of training because some people were new to the bank. Not everyone had been promoted through the ranks, so to speak, like me. And we had some ex-British Army chaps come in and teach us things like presentation skills and all the rest of it. And I think the level of professionalism is through the roof, certainly compared to my experiences back then. And it was just super valuable as a whole. So yeah, a ton of people that I've come across in the startup space also come from ex-forces backgrounds. They are veterans, some relatively recent, but often they've actually left, gone and set up their own thing, and then come to give back. So I think I agree with Magnus, and I agree with you that I'm not a big believer in like predestination or in like some amazing ability to create a black box that can predict success. But I do think that we, as startup investors, but also as startup founders, as well as advisors, we can kind of shape teams that are aligned, right? You agree?
It's not dissimilar to starting a startup, in that you can't determine ahead of time whether you're going to succeed, or else quite obviously there'd be far fewer failures. But what you can do is stack the deck in your favor by looking for characteristics that typically perform in a certain way. Here in the United States, whenever you do any type of advertising in the financial space, you have to say something akin to past performance isn't indicative of future results. However, very often, especially with people, there's strong similarities. If someone did a certain thing under certain circumstances, they're likely to do that again.
Yeah, look, fully agree with that. And I studied philosophy, logic, and scientific method at the LSE. And that's essentially what we were taught. We were taught to track patterns, to understand them, also not to over extrapolate. And that probably neatly brings me back to my experience at Antler, because Magnus, who is a super smart guy, and I take my hat off to him for what he has built, I think my gut feel, and I know a lot of VCs do this, they try and figure out if there are predictors of success, like data points that they can track that have correlated with success in their past portfolio companies, so that they can pick more people like that in the future. My fear is, and how Antler works, by the way, is they, so I think in my year they had 5,000 people apply for the London cohort, which was the first one. And they picked something like 50 or 70 of us to actually go into the room. And back then they were paying us some money, which was nice, just to be there, like a stipend to be there and do what many of us were doing anyway. But then they would invest in a certain number of us further down the line. The danger, though, I think, of almost pre-screening or selecting is that of those 5,000 or so people, obviously 4,950 or so never got a shot. Mm-hmm. And after my experience at Antler, there were a couple of things that didn't sit perfectly well with me. One was that we're actually highly selective, which makes sense for what they're trying to do. Yeah, okay, that's great.
Yeah.
But the other thing was
their money, their rules.
What's that, sorry?
Their money, their rules.
Right, yeah. I get it. But equally, and I often see this, I'm a bit of and I think similar to you, Jerry, a little bit of a problem identifier and then solver.
Yes.
I will see things that niggle at me. And rather than just being like, c'est la vie, que sera, sera, let it be. I'm like, oh man, maybe I could do something a bit better. So I left there. They didn't invest in me, but that was because I refused to team up. And back then they weren't, or maybe still don't invest in solo founders. But it just felt unnatural to me because I know, all of us know that one of, if not the greatest reason for any startup's failure is co-founder conflict. And the most egregious, and I was quite vocal about this on the cohort, but one of the most egregious examples of that was my mate's company from Antler, who did get funded. And in between signing the term sheet and the money landing in the bank, which wasn't very long, their team imploded because of co-founder conflict.
It's interesting because, and this is also common in the sales space, the very things that make someone a good founder often make them very difficult to work with. Passionate, visionary, thick-skinned, opinionated. That mindset of I'll work 25 hours a day, 8 days a week to make my dream come true. And then they meet somebody who wants to work 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. In any other circle, that's a hard worker. In ours, it's a part-timer. So yeah, 100% agree. And on that note, real quick, in the United States, the fail rate last year for startups was 93%. Now, last couple of years have been bonzo, so that's part of it. You hit on one of the important things. One of the biggest problems is founding team conflict. Another problem I found is bad understanding of business fundamentals. So people making, I'm not saying you need to have all of the answers when we start. Nobody does. I certainly didn't and still don't. But the more of a strong foundational understanding of all the components of operating your business, just the more easy mistakes you can miss.
I like that a lot. Yeah. And I think, I mean, maybe that neatly brings me on. I realize I'm still doing my intro, Jerry. And we did say before we recorded that I shouldn't just talk and talk and talk. So hopefully this is okay. But
We're good.
I'll try and wrap it up. So basically, I spent time at Antler. It was actually genuinely, it was great. I think they are doing amazing things. I just disagreed with elements of it. One of which was the pre-selection. And I knew, or my gut feel was from my early stage angel and VC investing experience, that actually at the early stage, often pre-team or whatever, it's really difficult to pick the winners. So anyone who does a conviction-based approach to early stage startups, maybe they get lucky, maybe they know something that I don't, and if they do, I'd love to know it. But I think a lot of the time they are going to fail, unfortunately. And then the second thing was that forcing people to team up just didn't feel right. And in the world of VCs, we often hear that having a co-founder is almost a prerequisite to getting that investment.
Very common.
And for very good reason, right? Because it does take a lot more than one person to build a business. But the counter argument to that is, who was Jeff Bezos' co-founder at Amazon? He didn't have one. He didn't build Amazon single-handedly. Of course he didn't. But he was the founder. And I think sometimes having that, as you were explaining earlier, that singular leader who's got all these incredible characteristics that lead them to be a founder and a leader can often be either diluted or they can butt heads against another co-founder. So inorganically forcing people to meet up or to team up, I think is wrong.
Yeah, it's interesting again. So I think that there are many things in the VC approach that aren't necessarily what's best for the startup. They're best for increasing the likelihood of a successful return for the VC. I don't mean that in some type of a sneaky VCs are bad people thing, but I think the perspective of the VC is, I have X dollars to invest. I need to get Y back or my VC will fail. Whereas the startup's perspective is, I want to grow my damn company. And those things, while they're often going the same direction, aren't necessarily always. And I can see the VC's perspective of life, like having more founders because there's more people hold accountable, more likelihood that somebody will come up with a winning idea. But to your point, it's also more likely that 2, 3, 5, however many co-founders are going to hit a pig-headed moment and blow up because they're all strong-willed personalities.
And I think riffing off that, part of the reason that VCs like to have many people around the table at the founder level is that they're kind of hedging their bets.
Yes.
And I'm same as you. I'm not anti-VC. I was a VC. I'm definitely not anti-VC, and they definitely have a place. I think the place that they have over the past few years kind of carved out for themselves has been diluted. And I think now that money is in shorter supply than it was, the money that they get from their investors or LPs is in shorter supply than it was. They're having to refine their approach and go after more what I would call true VC backable businesses, which is a good thing. But historically, yeah, you're right. Whilst the rough direction of travel that both founders and investors want the company to follow, is similar, directionally similar, there are times where those paths can either collide and not in a good way or completely diverge.
Yeah, I think that's true of any financing. If I go to the bank to get a mortgage for my house, I want that mortgage because I found a property that I love that I want to raise my family in. The bank doesn't care about that part. They care about, can this person repay the loan at an interest rate sufficient for it to be worth my time? So again, that mindset's important. But I don't want to spend too much time on the VC space. I'd like to shift gears a little bit into what makes a successful startup idea or startup. Is it the idea? Is it the execution? What's your experience, Mike?
Yeah, look, that is probably the question that I am most passionate about. And in my view, a lot of people who are aspiring founders and would otherwise start a business stop themselves from doing so by putting up this artificial barrier of thinking that they need an idea to start. And I fundamentally do not believe that is true. And part of that came from building that venture studio, where our job was to come up with validated ideas. That was, we didn't start with the idea. We just started with, we want to build something. Let's go out and find something to build. At Antler, where we were just in a room and we were told, find some people to team up with and go and tackle a problem. The idea didn't come at the beginning. It came later, often at the end of that process. And similarly, after Antler and after creating another VC-backed company I won't go into, I mentored 112 founders, I think it was, who were day zero founders, i.e. had not even started. And over the course of 12 months, I worked with them, not all at once, Jerry, of course, there wasn't enough time. But over the course of that 12 months, I worked with them to help them to build businesses, including latterly as a member of the faculty in an MBA program. And I learned two things there. One, it reinforced my idea that my ability to pick winners was not great, because people who on paper looked amazing actually didn't, it didn't always fail, but they certainly did not always outperform. And individuals who on paper I had written off, but still supported, of course, because they were paying me to do so, actually sometimes, not always, but sometimes did outperform. And I was like, wow, I'm missing a trick here. And I don't think it is possible to judge, as you said, on past performance, how someone is going to perform in the future. And people are malleable. But in short, none of those 100, or very few of those 112 people I work with actually started with an idea. And off the back of that experience, I set up this company called Underdog with a business partner of mine. I'll put the cap on briefly. Underdog, now Underdog X. X for experience and that X factor, because that's what we are looking for. I've ruined my hair. Christ. But what we're looking for are individuals. And I think that's the fundamental root of it. Not everyone, Jerry, and I'm sure you agree, not everyone is built to be a founder or necessarily can be taught. Do you agree with that?
Completely. I think there are so many paths to success, and being a startup founder is one of them. But being truthful, it's not the easy. It's probably the hardest or one of the hardest paths, but it's not the best path for most. For most people, starting a company is an objectively bad idea. And if me saying that makes you think you shouldn't, you are certainly in that category.
And that's exactly, we should get you on our program, actually, because this is the type of stuff that I preach, I suppose, from my pulpit, not that high up. Yeah. And I say that to people. So we take the opposite approach to, say, Antler and most programs, where we say you don't need to apply, you simply sign up and show up. That's what we do, because we don't want to exclude people. At Underdog, everyone gets a shot, and that's important to me. But it is my job, and you're probably going to hate this analogy because it's a SEALs, the BUDS training analogy. And of course, we're not a military organization or anything. But during BUDS, that selection process, the instructors are constantly telling the people who are applying, you are going to fail. Get up. You should quit. Get up. Ring that bell. Ring that bell. Give up. This is not the path for you. And that's what we do as well. We tell them they ain't going to make it. And that is fine. There are plenty of other paths, as you mentioned, to success. But the ones who do throw up, two fingers, which may or may not be the middle ones at me, and say, no, I'm going to prove you wrong, they are the ones that we want.
Yes. I love that, because you're right. Again, I don't know what it is in England and in Britain, but in this country, 93% fail rate. Those are darn near lottery winning numbers. So if you're going to persevere through that minefield, you've got to want it. And you're right. The idea, many of us are on our third or fourth company. Either we exited our earlier companies in a positive way, acquisition, IPO, whatever, or it didn't pan out. So I'll use myself as an example. My very first company was targeted at providing sales and recruiter training to technology services companies. It didn't fail. I could be doing that to this day, but it capped out at a point that I wasn't happy about. I couldn't find a way to grow beyond that made sense to me. So I shuttered it and pivoted to this. So again, you're more likely to fail than me.
Is that you had an idea of what success looked like for you. And you knew that you capped out and that wasn't enough. A lot of founders, they don't have that. And that for me well, at Underdog, that's our very first module is helping founders or prospective founders to uncover their why the heck they want to enter this crazy world where you're right, the chances of winning the lottery are probably greater than actually succeeding in business. Why do they want to do it? And what does success look like for them? Because for some people, success might have nothing or almost nothing to do with financial returns or monetary value.
Yes.
They might want to impact the world or leave a legacy behind for future generations or change an industry. Like for them, that might be success. But unless we help them to uncover what is important to them, what they end up building might not be what they actually want to build in the first place. Does that make sense?
It's almost scary how in alignment we are. The very first thing I do with a new client is ask them, what does success look like for you? Do you have an exit plan? Do you ever want to exit? What does that look like? Because to your point, if I'm running a small local, technology services company or custom software development company, success for me might be I'm earning X dollars per year. Success for me might be in 5 years I can have my company acquired. Success for me might be I want my children to take over my company. And any of those answers, any of those things knowing them ahead of time is going to empower me to make the decisions that lead me to that, instead of spending 3 to 5 years racing in the wrong direction.
And that for me is why the idea is less important. Of course, eventually it does become important, but at the beginning, let's set the rules of engagement. Let's understand what success looks like. Then what we do is we help individuals uncover or identify their spike. And by that, I mean their ability to be world-class at something. Mm-hmm. And I truly believe everyone has got that ability. In some cases, or in most cases, it's simply untapped. Once they've got that, then that gives them a foundation or almost a springboard to jump off, because then they can choose their audience that they want to serve initially for that beachhead approach. And then they go out and do customer discovery. That element of actually going out there and talking to people who might be your future customers to understand the problems that they face. And only after having done that, 10, 20, at Antler, I think they made us do it 100 times before we launched. We say at Underdog, 10 or 20 will give you enough data points to start. Then we can use that double diamond methodology you've probably come across before, where we say this was our starting point. We've gone out and identified loads of problems. We're now going to identify one problem to work on. We're going to come up with loads of ideas to tackle that problem. And then we're going to use various tools that we teach on the program to narrow down to one specific idea to go out and test in the market. And that there is halfway through our program. Not at the start.
So when we first spoke and we came up with the idea of a title for the episode being Your Idea Doesn't Matter, I was a little skeptical because that's a pretty bold statement. Your idea doesn't matter. I'm pretty sure Zuckerberg would disagree. But even with that example, when you look at the iterations that Facebook has been through from where it started in Harvard so many years ago to where it is today, it really proves your thesis. Making sure the founder is capable of being a real founder, making sure that there's a foundation to build an idea off of. Again, that's why you see serial entrepreneurs, because they are the right person and something happened in their early companies, either a positive exit or otherwise, that said to them, this is my lifestyle. This is the way I like to exist.
And it's a very special lifestyle. And again, for the vast majority of people, it's not the right lifestyle. But what we want to do is remove as many barriers to entry as possible to allow people to try. Because the worst thing for me would be for 100 people that we might work with. And, of those 100, by the way, only 3 to 5 might actually launch a company that eventually might become successful. But for the 95, 97 others to have never tried. At least if they've tried, then they can sit back and say, yeah, it wasn't for me. But allowing an idea, it's almost like an excuse, right? It's a crutch. Oh, I've not really landed on the right idea. Forget about that. Forget about the idea. Just get started. Just get started. And we have had, like hundreds, probably thousands of people come through our program. And we're, by the way, a free program. We don't charge any money to founders, but we are paid by action, i.e., they've got to take action every single week to progress, or we kick them out. We are ruthless. We are brutal. If you're not putting in the work, you're cut. You're cut from the team. And we've had to be like that. But of the 1,000 plus probably that have come through the programs, one always sticks in my mind, and he's now in his 60s. Probably, in other circumstances would have been retired, was very, very successful in his career and had founded one or maybe two startups before. And I said to him, gosh, why are you on our program? You know what you're doing. You've got access to the resources, the network, you've got a great skill set. Why are you on our program? And he said to me, Mike, the way that you think about startups is completely different from anything I've come across before. And actually, you are making me question the foundational and fundamental elements of my business. And I don't think I'm going to continue building what I thought I was going to build in the first place. And he actually now is building something fundamentally different.
That's awesome. Let me ask you a question, Mike. If you could give one piece of advice to any entrepreneur or early stage business person, founder, what would that advice be?
So I would use a quote that I've probably stolen but reappropriated as my own. And that is better done than perfect.
Yes.
And often it's another crutch, right? We let perfection get in the way of actually going out there and taking action. And our entire program at Underdog is built around action taking and just doing something. As a good friend of mine says, he says, doing something or doing anything is better than doing nothing. If you do nothing, you're never going to succeed. If you do almost anything, you're probably going to land on something. But doing something specific and intentional, that is what is going to lead to a greater probability of success for you. So for us, action taking in the first place, absolutely, doing just about anything is better than sitting there watching. I'm sorry to say it, Jerry, but probably a lot of your listeners sitting back and watching us and thinking, oh yeah, maybe I should do something. But, doing something specific is great.
Yeah, I want to expand on two parts of what you said there. The first one about perfectionism, and I'll tag on what you just ended with about consuming media. Very often, that perfectionism is fear in disguise. They say to themselves, it's not good enough yet to put out. What they're really meaning is, I'm not confident, and I want to sit back. I'm not ready to expose myself yet. Same thing with learning materials. I'm an avid reader and I'm an author. But that said, if you're just consuming media, very often it's because you're reluctant to actually do something, which brings me to the second part, and that's erring in the direction of action. When I'm managing a sales team, that is one of the chief criteria I judge early salespeople from. When in doubt, do you pick the phone up and make a dial, or do you go and try to get somebody to help you? Because I'd rather the person who picks up the phone and makes the dial. Because even if it's a bad call, they did the thing. They didn't sit back. So I couldn't agree more.
I love that. And for me, I look at it as reps at bat. The more you do something, especially if you're getting external validation or invalidation of your approach, the more you do it, the more you're able to iterate and pivot and refine. And that's probably like, as well as a propensity to take action, the other thing is coachability. That's what we look for. People who are either able to self-coach or are open and receptive to external indicators as to whether what they are doing is effective or not. And they're able to make that change either themselves or with a bit of guidance.
Coachability's importance never goes away. In the early stages of your career, obviously it impacts your speed of growth. But later in your career, and it puts me in mind of that 60-year-old person that you're talking about earlier, it keeps you in the game because as things change out in the environment, out in the culture, being coachable keeps you able to see and interact in a way that's relevant to those newer folks. The example I give, I'm 53 years old. I'm an old Gen Xer. So when I'm dealing with Gen Z folks, their core concerns are often a lot more similar to older generations than what you would be led to believe. But how they articulate those and how they need to be interacted with to get to them is completely different than what I was raised doing. So if I'm not able to learn and continue to grow in how I interact with those folks, I'll lose the ability to communicate.
It makes a lot of sense to me. And, they say you can't teach an old dog new tricks. In my view, you can teach an old underdog new tricks.
Yeah.
You absolutely can. And that's what we're looking for.
Yeah, it's the inability to learn that makes that dog an old dog. you know?
You're young at heart, yeah. And we'll probably continue. I don't know about you, Jerry, but my business partner, Steve, and I, we talk about doing this forever. Nothing will stop us. We'll continue doing this until we're on our deathbeds, to be frank, because we love it.
I grew up working blue collar. I'm a blue collar guy. My dad's in his late 70s and still works full time in a physical job. If I retired early sitting at a computer desk, he would disown me.
And that's a motivating factor if there ever was one, Jerry. I love that.
Yes, and you hit on something. So I'm a lifelong martial artist as well. And one of the things that we talk about is maintaining a beginner's mind. If you ever get to a point where you think you know everything, where you're the expert, your best day was the day before you had that thought, because you started the slippery slope downward. Those that continue to achieve at a high level, they have that childlike mind where they always want to learn new things. And that's what I think you're talking about.
And I'm also a lifelong martial artist. We've not talked about that before, but yeah, I've been training Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu off and on for over 20 years. And before that was doing other stuff. But for me, the great thing about the martial arts is there is a very visceral kind of impact. Whether you're good or you're bad is not subjective, it's objective, because you're going to lose and get hurt if you are terrible. And it's the same in business, as long as you're open to those signals. Yes. So yeah, let's get started, guys.
Yeah, 100%. Yes. So I think that's a good place to wrap up. I feel like there's a ton more that we could talk about, but that's a good place to wrap up. We covered a lot of material, but really the biggest focus is get started, bruise your knuckles, learn your lessons, and keep charging forward.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, Mike, I really appreciate you being on the show. If people want to learn more about you and what you're doing at Underdog X, where can they find out about you?
So the best place to reach me and to see what I'm up to at this moment in time is my LinkedIn. So if you just search for Mike Bank, you'll find me. And I think you'll probably provide a link, won't you, Jerry?
Awesome. I was going to say, for long-time listeners, you know that will be in the show notes. For new-time listeners, don't crash your car trying to write that down. Just go back to the show notes when you're done and get it there. Thanks again, Mike, for being on. Let's wrap it here. For everybody out there in the audience, as always, have a great week. Look forward to seeing you next week. Bye, Mike.
Cheers, Jerry. Catch you soon, my friend.